So now that you've got the bird's eye view of the fluent chain of methods, both streams and completable futures in this application, we're then going to start breaking down each of the steps and looking at the different types of completable future methods, starting with factory methods, and show how to apply them. In this particular case, we're going to talk about the supplyAsync factory method because that's the one we're going to use here. In general, supplyAsync is much more popular than runAsync because it returns a completable future that can have results. So you can see we use the factory methods to kind of set the whole thing in motion. That's usually the way that the factory methods work with completable futures. And this is going to be done inside of this behavior called check URL cached async. And what that's going to do, as the name may give us a hint, is we're going to asynchronously check to see if a URL has already been downloaded and therefore does not need to be brought back by downloading it again. We can just get it right out of the cache. What map returns is a stream of completable futures to optional URLs. And you might ask, why do we have optionals? We'll see how the reason for that in a second. But leaving aside why we need an optional, just recall what an optional is. An optional is a special object that started with Java 8 that will have a value if, in this case, the URL is not cached, or will be empty if it is already cached. And so we're going to use this as a very, very clever technique to asynchronously handle results and allow us to filter them out without having to do any joins or gets along the way in order to use the actual filter intermediate operation. If you recall some of the comments I gave back for assignment 3's initial submission said, don't try to apply filter on completable futures because they won't do what you think. And we're going to see that this is a way to work around that particular quirk of completable futures. So later behaviors are just going to ignore empty optional URL values. And an optional is empty if the URL has already been downloaded and cached previously. So we indicate that something doesn't need to be processed any further in this chain by having an optional that's empty. And you'll see how that applies here in a second. But first, let's go ahead and take a look and see how the check URL cached method works and how it uses the supplyAsync factor method. So you can find this particular method, check URL cached async, in the ImageStream CompletableFuture base file. And this particular use of the supplyAsync factor method registers an action, and that action, of course, will be run asynchronously in a thread, in a worker thread in the common fork join pool. Now, the way I do this, just to leave myself some room for changing my mind later, is I have a method called getExecutor, which itself is a factory method. And users can override that method to provide different thread pools for use in processing all these asynchronous computations. In this particular case, we're going to set the executor for this particular implementation for the ImageStream CompletableFuture 1 variant to use the fork join pool common pool. So we're using the common fork join pool. But if we were to take a look at the ImageStream CompletableFuture 2 implementation, we'd see that we would have a different pool used there. So long and the short of it, this means that supplyAsync is going to run the action that was registered here in a worker thread from the common fork join pool. Here's the action that gets registered. You can see this is just a good old Lambda expression. And what it does is it uses something called ofNullable. And what ofNullable is going to do is it's going to take the result that comes to it as a parameter from this call to URL cached. So URL cached, as we'll see, is a little helper method that's going to check to see if we've already downloaded and processed, transformed, and stored this URL earlier. And if the URL is cached, if that method returns true, then you can see here we're going to give it a null, meaning that we're going to ignore it. Otherwise, we're going to give it the URL. And ofNullable is a factory method on optional, which creates an optional, which is either going to have a value present if the image was not cached, or if the image was previously cached, it'll have a null value. So it'll be an empty optional. So that's what we're doing here. We're using optional to keep track of whether something's been cached previously. So URL cached, you can see here, it's just a very simple helper method that you can look at from the ImageStreamGang base class or superclass. And what it'll do is it returns true if the image has already been downloaded and filtered before. And URL cached calls this other URL cache method that checks to see if an image file already exists. That's really actually the same as what we did with the parallel streams implementation earlier. We're just using it here in an asynchronous context called from the supplyAsync factor method. There are clearly better ways of doing caching. I think I mentioned before when we talked about parallel streams that you could also do something that involves the age field, the max age field that's used with HTTP. And you can basically set up websites so that an image will only live a certain amount of time, after which point the client is instructed to go back and refresh the cache. So that's a quick overview of the use of supplyAsync. And you can see here that the supplyAsync factor method is invoked, as it almost always is, to kind of set the wheels in motion. And that means that from the get-go, this whole set of processing operations will be run asynchronously in threads in the common fork join pool. So we'll keep going on and looking at other types of completable future methods in a second, but that was supplyAsync. That's where things get started.